The Bear Brook murder case began in 1985 when two bodies were discovered dismembered and stuffed in a barrel. Concealed in the overgrowth of the forest floor of the Bear Brook State Park in New Hampshire, in spite of a nationwide search, thousands of hours of investigative work, and the discovery of two more bodies 15 years later, the case remained cold. That is until 2017, when advancements in forensic DNA analysis broke the case wide open. Here to discuss how genealogical DNA led investigators to the identity of the Bear Brook murder, we have DNA consultant and expert Mehul Anjaria. Mehul, thank you so much for being here.
Tracy, it's great to be here.
So I want to talk about the Bear Brook case, and obviously this is an incredibly complicated case, but since I have you here, I want to really focus in on why the forensic DNA is so important.
Right, so in Bear Brook, this was one of the first big uses of genetic genealogy. And not only was it one of the first uses, but it was used in a very ingenious way to identify the killer.
How did they do that?
There was a woman by the name of Lisa.
Yes.
And she had been abducted, abused, and abandoned by a man in the 1980s. Ultimately, she went to foster care and was adopted.
And the abductor was Terry Rasmussen.
Right. Terry Rasmussen was eventually arrested and held to answer for those crimes. Didn't do a lot of time in prison. He got out, he actually committed murder. Mm-hmm. At that time, they took DNA from him.
Now, Terry Rasmussen died in 2010 in prison.
Fortunately, yes.
So meanwhile, what's going on with Lisa?
So as many people who've been adopted do, she wanted to know, who's my mother and where did I come from?
Yeah.
So she started using this genetic genealogy with Barbara Ray Venter, and she was able to locate her mother. Now, her mother was last seen in New Hampshire.
That's where the Bear Brook murders occurred.
Yeah, and she was actually known to last be seen with Terry Rasmussen. At that point, they took DNA from Terry Rasmussen, compared it to one of the female victims in the barrel, and found out that he was the father of one of the girls. So he was now tied to the crime.
Right. Do you believe if Lisa wasn't looking for her ancestors, this case would have never been solved?
Well, I don't know about never, but it would have taken much more time. This was a very, very fortunate happenstance, and if she didn't start digging into her genealogy, tracing it from California to New Hampshire, we wouldn't be where we are today.
So this case is fascinating for a lot of reasons. I think one of the reasons is that it was concluded using genealogical DNA. Can you kind of dig a little deeper into that for us?
Yeah, sure. So in a case with DNA, let's say that we have a sexual assault case, for example, and we have DNA that we know is from the perpetrator. And so typically what you do is you would compare that to any known suspects and say you don't get any matches. You might even do a DNA dragnet in the neighborhood. Maybe the cops go out and collect DNA from all the males within a 3-block radius who are willing to give DNA. And let's say you don't get any matches there. Well, now you can go to the FBI's CODIS database and you can search your profile in there to see if you get any hits. You might not hit directly on the perpetrator in that database, but you might hit on the perpetrator's sibling or parent. Mm-hmm. So that's happened on a few cases. Grim Sleeper in LA was the biggest example of that. So now once that happens, you bring in a genealogist. So now the DNA aspect is sort of out of it. Now you're going old school. Genealogist is going to try to figure out what is the connection between these two people and how are they related. And in order to do that, they have to build out family trees, see where they intersect, and try to figure out who this perpetrator might actually be.
So it seems like to me that genealogical DNA is a combination of scientific analysis and detective work.
That's 100% correct. So it's not that either of them is new. I think it's putting them together with the latest technology is what is new and what's this powerful technique.
So after the Bear Brook murder was solved, the Golden State Killer murder was solved shortly thereafter.
That's right. So basically the genealogist who worked on Bear Brook, Barbara Ray Venter, all of a sudden she was a hot commodity.
Right.
So the people who were investigating Golden State Killer went to her and said, hey, how about it with the Golden State Killer? So they put it in GEDmatch, and it didn't directly hit on the guy, but it hit on a distant relative, and then through that they went through classic genealogy to narrow it down and then finally get to Joseph James D'Angelo. In several months they had that solved as well.
So forensic DNA technology definitely had its limits in 1985. What were investigators actually able to do?
Well, like I said, there was DNA available, but it was in its infancy. So at the time, the testing, it took over a month to conduct. It was kind of clunky, actually. You needed a lot of DNA. So for example, you needed a blood stain about the size of a dime to have any hope of getting a result.
I feel like people are expecting this type of technology to be implemented in every single case.
Well, it's being used more and more now for a couple reasons. I see that different private labs are offering it, so there's more infrastructure. But this is brand new, this is costly. This is only used on the most serious of cases because it's a ton of manpower.
So what's the timeline like on something like this?
Well, it's very labor intensive, and often there's a team of people working this because you have to chase down a bunch of leads, you have to talk to relatives, you have to look at records. So like Bear Brook, I heard a figure like 20,000 hours were spent by a team.
Yeah.
So it's very, very labor intensive.
Mehul, thank you so much for coming on and explaining genealogical DNA and really breaking it down. I feel like I actually understand it now.
Well, that's great. Sure, it was my pleasure, and I enjoyed our conversation.
Yeah, and thank you guys for watching. We'll see you next time. Bye.